busy, we get it, but you want it for kissing. Get a head start. The end isn't written in stone or a poem or in an opinion. Let's start the conversation. It's all about your vision. Take a second and listen to the rhythm of choice, cause it's your decision to know your options, to know your position. Let's start the conversation. This is your show. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. You have the option to write your last chapter, to breathe a bit better, to capture the factors that matter most to you and yours. Focus on the things that matter. Once you have written it, they can understand it. You'll never be gladder. Focus on the things that matter. This is your show. Before the curtains fall, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. You're running a mile a minute. Who is it? We're cramming so much in it. Take a cosmic second to think about it, to dream about it. If you wanna leave a legacy, from now until then it's your option to leave the way you lived, with purpose and direction and reconnection. If you're gonna leave a legacy, this is a show. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. Tonight, it's my right. Hey. Take the drama out the death, take the breath, take a second. Make another choice, listen to your voice, take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. This is my life. Take the drama out of death. Take a breath, take a second. Make another choice. Listen to your voice, take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. This is my life. This is
Welcome to End of Life Empowerment and the Faith Community. My name is Brandy Alexander, the National Director of Community Engagement at Compassion and Choices, and I will be your moderator today. Next slide. Before we get started today, please note that today's webinar is being recorded. Please also note that everyone is in view only mode. This means both your audio and video functions are disabled and neither will appear in the recording. This recording will also be available in the future if you would like to receive a copy of it. We will have a formal question and answer session at the end of the formal presentation. To ask a question of today's panelist, please type your question in the Q&A box on your screen and click send. Please note that if you would like to send it anonymously, there's a checkbox in the left corner, so your name will not be attached to your question, and we will answer as many questions as we can get to during the designated time. Compassion and Choices is the nation's oldest and largest and most active nonprofit working to improve care and expand options and empower everyone to chart their end-of-life journey. We envision a society that affirms life and accepts the inevitability of death, embraces expanded options for compassionate dying, and empowers everyone to choose the end-of-life care that reflects their values, priorities, and beliefs. Today, we will learn and talk about the power of planning, particularly in the Black community in honor of Black History Month. We believe that planning equals peace. We will hear from faith leaders today who have seen the benefits of being prepared and the impact of not having their affairs in order on end of life and the impact it has on our communities. I'm delighted to introduce our amazing panelists today, and I will share a few highlights from their impressive and extensive bios. First, we have Reverend Charles McNeil, who is the pastor of Unity Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Pastor McNeil is the past president of the National Capital Baptist Convention of the Washington, D.C. area and vicinity. He's also the chair of the 2022 National Baptist Convention that will be happening in the Washington, D.C. area. He serves as on the executive board of the National Baptist Convention and is the first vice moderator of the Mount Bethel Baptist Association. He's also the faith-based liaison of the Prince George's County, Maryland County Executive, Angela Alsobrook. And lastly, he's the chairman of the board of United Community Against Poverty. He's been on MSNBC as a commentator, and he is also a member of Compassion and Choices African American Leadership Council. Next, we have Reverend Dr. Carolyn Gilmore, who is currently the senior pastor at Galatians Baptist Church located in Washington, D.C. Dr. Gilmore earned her undergraduate degree in clinical psychology from the University of Maryland. She continued her studies at Howard University and earned a master's and doctorate majoring in clinical psychology and minor in criminology. After receiving her calling to the ministry, she enrolled in Wilbur Waters School of Religion and Theology Studies and received a bachelor's, master's, and doctorate of divinity in theology. She later became the dean of Wilbur Waters School and presently serves as the vice chair of the board of directors. Lastly, we have Dr. Jeff Gardier. Dr. Jeff is a board certified clinical psychologist. He's one of the most widely sought after experts in the field of mental health. In addition to having a private practice in Manhattan, he is also the associate professor and course director of behavioral medicine at Touro College of Osteopathic Medicine in New York City. Dr. Jeff is also an ordained minister with a doctorate of divinity from the New Seminary. Dr. Jeff is better known as America's Psychologist, as he has been featured on many shows such as The Today Show, MSNBC, and CNN. He's written over a half a dozen books, And his education started at the University of Rochester, where he gained his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, and continued his education at George Washington University, where he gained his PhD in Psychology and Philosophy. Next slide, please. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Reverend Dr. Boise Kimber, who is the president of the Connecticut State Missionary Baptist Convention. Reverend Boise will open us up today with comments and a prayer to welcome his convention members and other faith leaders and attendees. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Kimber.
Thank you so very much, and to all of you who have
You're
joined.
muted, Dr. Kimber.
Well, you got to unmute me on that side then.
You're good, Dr. Kimber.
Okay. Thank you so very much. And to all of you who have joined us on today, and our panelists, and to our sponsors, I greet you in the name of Him who orders our steps. We are delighted to share with you, and the members of our state convention is very excited that you have called us together to talk to us in reference to our compassion choice. And so thank you so very much for the invitation, for the hard work that you all are doing, and we look forward to our partnership. Let us pray. The God of our father and mother, the creator of this universe, the author and finisher of our faith, we gather in this space this afternoon to say thank you for how good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. And so as we move forward, we ask that your hands of mercy and grace will be upon each one of us. Bless our guests that will speak to us on this day. Continue to give us knowledge and instilled in us the rights to have a life with you, and the right to have a life after this life is over. Give us strength, give us courage. It is in your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us today. So we'll begin today with a short video about the values of end-of-life planning. It features all of our speakers today, some of our staff, and other advocates from Compassion and Choices. At Compassion and Choices, we have worked with different community groups and community leaders to start having these conversations before a time of crisis, so that we are sort of desensitizing ourselves to the subject of death and taking sort of the fear aspect away from it and the mystery around dying and really planning for it.
We plan all the time for everything. You know, we plan for birthdays, we plan for weddings, we plan just because. And I think that we need to plan for your end of life.
There are many, many psychological, very positive effects when it comes to planning. Because planning means what? That you have the mind and the will to be able to look into the future. Planning means to be able to look at your goals, where you have the ultimate decision, but you do have the opinions and the support of those around you.
Sometimes it get hard, because you're bumping heads when you start hitting with people's belief systems.
I have noticed that with Blacks that we have a tendency of not want to talk about death or not even think about death in any way. And so I realize with my members, their knowledge of even making preparations from death is very low, but I tend to add it into my pastoring them. I always have. But as a people, I think we tend to not want to even think about death.
My cousins and relatives used to tell me all the time, man, don't go to the doctor, because when you go to the doctor, man, when they come back from the doctor, they usually die. But they don't understand that what happened was that because you didn't go to the doctor, all of this stuff was going on in your body, and now you at stage 4, and now the doctor says there's nothing I can do. So now I think what we have to do is prepare people and educate people.
Will you have all the answers if that person's in the emergency room or the person has passed? No, but at least you have some kind of roadmap before if you have that conversation, you know? So I think that in a perfect world, to make it run smoother, have the conversation now.
You know, we have to continue to educate, push, and make people really understand and see. You know, the best thing to do is to sit down and have a conversation.
It's a tough subject. It's a tough subject, but when you plan, things run smoother. It won't be perfect, but it'll be smoother.
We have created a lot of tools and resources that really can help foster that conversation and really break down those specific issues that you face at end of life.
So preparation for anything is good. You need to be prepared. So you get prepared by getting the information. That's the value of compassionate choices.
We found that just by even getting the information out there, that we can probably impact some of those disparities because people just aren't aware that they have access to some of these options.
So that really sets the stage for what we'll be talking about today, and that is really the value of planning and how it provides peace. Next slide, please. So what do all these people have in common? Other than them being some of our greatest individuals in our community, all of them passed away without having any affairs in order, meaning they did not have advance directives or living wills. So I'm sure we have a lot of James Brown fans out there. In 2006, when he passed away, he had 7 kids, and 4 ex-wives, and his body stayed on ice for 8 weeks and was moved 14 times before he was finally laid to rest because there were so many disagreements about where he should be buried. B.B. King in 2016 had 15 kids, all with different moms, and 2 wives, which he didn't have any children with. So his manager, executor, kids, spouses, and all fought over years over his estate and final resting place. Aretha Franklin had an $80 million estate with no living will. And this, we tend to think it's a younger person's issue, but when you think about Bobby Christina, who was only 22 years old when she fell into a coma for 6 months, her father had to make that difficult decision to discontinue her treatment, not knowing what it is she wanted. Most recently, Chadwick Boseman passed away, and he also didn't have a living will. We've got Bob Marley and others as well. So Prince. So if our most sort of individuals with the most resources aren't doing the planning, what must that mean for the rest of our community? It's a very widespread problem. So I will now pass it over to Reverend McNeil, who will discuss specific end-of-life disparities and how they impact the Black community.
Good afternoon. And as you see on the screen, Ecclesiastes 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 2 is a very familiar text that we read to let us know that there's time for everything. And most of it reveals to us that there's a time for planning. And most of us who are pastors have seen the lack of preparation that families have as they scramble now, trying to figure out what to do next. And we want to talk about some of those disparities. Next slide. Health disparities between African Americans and other white counterparts are well documented. There's less research on disparities between these groups at the end of life. Compassionate Choices is committed to addressing health disparities so that all Americans can make health care decisions according to their own values and beliefs. Many of the end of life disparities that impact the Black community are only perpetuated and worsened by not having our affairs in order. Next slide. One result of health disparity is
the low rate at which African Americans prepare for the end of life by creating advanced directives. Filling out this form is another great way to improve end of life care. An advanced directive is an important set of documents that outline end of life priorities. It provides peace of mind by explaining what healthcare people would prefer. Advanced directives are state-specific free forms that give you an opportunity to write down what your end-of-life treatment wishes are in case there becomes a time when you can't speak for yourself. It is also when you identify your power of attorney who will speak for you if when the time comes. Only 36% of Blacks have completed advanced directives compared to 70% of the white population. Next slide. So we want to ask you a question. How many of you have completed an advanced directive? So we want to stop and pause here very quickly and just take a quick survey of the people on the call who may, and see how many of you have completed an advanced directive. We'll give you just a few minutes here.
Pouring in. I'll let you know when they slow down.
Okay.
Okay, looks like we have just about everybody, so I'm going to end the poll now.
Okay. And these are the results. 65% completed advanced directives, and 18% have begun the process, and 17% still need to get started. Thank you for your honesty. If we can move to our next slide. Another end-of-life disparity is rooted in African Americans under use hospice care. You can see here that 76% of Americans who use hospice are white, while Blacks, Native Americans, and Latinos make up a much smaller population of hospice users. In fact, according to the National Hospice and Palliative Care Association, only 8% of hospice users are African Americans. Next slide. Here, we can begin any discussion about health disparities without acknowledging how the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on the African American community. This chart is a snapshot of the disparity where, for example, African Americans in California account for 4% of COVID deaths, despite making up only 6% of California's population. Additionally, a study from Health Affairs shows that African Americans are 2.7 as likely as white people to end up hospitalized with the disease. African American population is more adversely affected by the pandemic for a number of reasons. African Americans are far more likely to be employed as frontline workers, home health care aides, grocery employees, where exposure to the virus is greater. In New York, for example, 75% of frontline workers are African Americans. These same industries often provide no health insurance and little or no sick pay. African Americans have higher rates of many illness, making them particularly susceptible to the severe effects of COVID-19. These coexisting health problems are not biological. They are due to social and environmental deterrents of health, such as a lack of health insurance, living in environments negatively affect health, such as food deserts with unstable housing and exposure to environmental pollution. These environmental deterrents of health from decades of public policies that marginalize, segregate, and underinvest in African American communities. So now that we know some of what the community is being impacted with, we will hear personal experience with loss from Reverend Dr. Carolyn Gilmore.
Thank you, Dr. McNeil. Good afternoon to everyone. Since we have heard about the impact that the different various ailments and difficult disparities in our community, we're going to start off by showing a video from our state representative, Rena Moran from Minnesota. She shared her story during a seminar.
My mother died from cancer. And then I have a sister who also died of cancer. In the Black community where we don't really discuss death and dying, because of that, I just wonder how different those last moments of my mother's life would and could have been had we had someone to sit down and walk us through the end of life options. Maybe she could have been at home with us instead of in the hospital.
This reminds me of what I see with my church and members and what happens in my own family. Next slide. I'm going to tell you a few stories today, and the first story is going to be about two of my brothers. One is named Carl, and the first picture, the one that's standing up with the glasses, is Carl. And in the second picture is my brother Cleveland sitting down with the young lady. I'm going to tell you a story about them with their end of life, what happened to them, with both of them at the end of their life. Carl, in the first picture, was murdered. He was murdered, and when he died, he didn't have any life insurance. He didn't have any monies that we knew of to bury him. And we literally had to collect money among ourselves to bury him. And also we had to use things that some of us in my brother Cleveland and I had made some preparations for our end of life, that we actually had to use those things to bury him. I had purchased a casket at the time from a Jewish warehouse, and at that time it was $500, and we had to bury him in there, which most of the people thought that we had paid all this money for this casket, but we had to use that Star of David casket to bury him in, and we had to scrounge up everything. My brother Cleveland, on the other hand, his story goes about him will go a little bit deeper, because he had pre-planned and had made all of his arrangements for his death, and had given instructions to his children. And at his end of life, he died with peace, and his family, we all was at comfort, because everything was taken care of him, because he had made the planning. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is my mother and father. My mother's in the middle, and my father's with me as a young girl and on the other side. My mother and father both died 5 months. My mom died first, and my father died 5 months and 2 weeks after her death. My mom had planned her death, and she would talk to us about dying. She knew she had a lot of ailments. She had a heart condition. She was a diabetic, high blood pressure. She had a lot of conditions, and that she knew that death was, she was going to die. from these ailments. And she would often talk to us about her plans of how she wanted everything to occur when she died and everything. And being African-American family, of course, we didn't want to hear what she had to say, and we would shy away. And often she would talk to me and I would say, Mom, I don't want to hear that. And she was like, oh, you don't want to talk about death? And I was like, no. And she said, well, we all going to die. And so we need to talk about it. And so my mom prepared us, and she actually did everything that she possibly could do to prepare us for her end of life, to the point that she had planned her funeral. She had made her arrangements, everything. All my brother and I had to do was sign on the dotted line. And she had talked to the funeral director. She had him at her bedside in the hospital, had picked out her casket, had picked out, in 1995 is when she died. And at that time they used to wear shrouds. She had picked out her peach shrouds because peach was her favorite color. She had her nails done, her hair done. The cosmetology at the funeral home said I didn't have to do nothing to her but just get her ready and just dress her, because she had made all her preparations. She had talked to her pastor, had made out her funeral, her obituary, made out of her funeral plan, her funeral service, what was to be sung. She had told the pastor what to preach. She had done everything. And my brother Cleveland, who earlier I talked about, in 1995, we sat down, we talked, and we said, you know, this was a quite a different experience of losing a loved one. And then we didn't even realize that 5 months later, we was going to lose our dad. And when we lost our dad, my dad did not have everything together like my mom. And so we were like arguing with each other and going through all kind of changes and everything. And my brother Cleveland and I was like saying, you know, when mom died, it was so much easier. But now with dad, it's confusing. So we realized that our mom loved us so much that she had planned her end of life to give us peace and comfort. And so at that point, we started making our arrangements for our end of life and planning, and start paying on pre-planning for that. And we're so grateful to that, because it caused us to really, us and our other siblings, to realize the necessity to talk about death and to get our affairs in order. Next slide, please. Recently, I just lost a dear friend of mine who we were friends. Our kids grew up together. Our kids were friends. My grands were friends with, grew up together. And Jenny Fant, she called me my girl. And she's also a member. She was a member of my church, and her family is a member of the church. But recently she passed away, and she had chosen to die with dignity. So she had chosen to have home hospice care where she would be with her family. She had chosen to do palliative care with taking the drugs to make her comfortable. She had chosen this, but in dying, she would have conversations with me, and she would talk to me about dying, and she was preparing me about death. And she said, I'm going to leave you, my girl. And I said, okay. And so she was like saying, I told her that I'm really not ready for you to go just yet. And she said, you know, no one should suffer. No one should ever live this way. She said, I'm ready to go, and you have to let me go. So I said, okay, I'll let you. So it was okay for her to go. She said, let me die with my dignity. Let me die that I'm in my right mind, and I can still say that I love you. And so she chose to go this pathway. And at her last moment by her bedside, she had asked for her family, her daughter, her husband, her grands, and myself to be there. And she was holding on to my hand, and she was telling me her goodbyes, but her one granddaughter was not there.
And when Shayla came through the door, she held on for Shayla to come through the door because she wanted to die with peace and dignity. And so, but she wanted us to know that she loved us, and she wanted to thank us and thank her family for giving her the love and the support and making her last days beautiful days in death. And so when her granddaughter got through the door, she said, "I'm here, Grandma." She said, "I love you." And she looked at her granddaughter. She said, "I love you. It's over. I'm gone." And she took her last breath. And I just am so grateful that I had the opportunity to hold her hand in her last days and see her take her last breath, and to see the beauty of the Lord as he took her home with peace and dignity. Now, and I will never forget, and I will always shed a tear as I remember that January the 18th, 2021, when she said her goodbye and told me that she loves me. Now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Jeff. He will now talk about some of the reasons why we see the inequities, the unfairness and injustice in care, and the mistrust of the medical community, and what we can do to address the disparities, as well as the psychological benefits of planning.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Gilmore. And I believe we all shed a tear with you. Thank you so very much for sharing that very personal story. And there's so much that we can learn from that. And it is an inspiration for all of us. All right, let me go through the slides set as quickly as I can, given that, we do want to stick with time as much as we can in this particular presentation. So let's talk about the leading causes of death in the African-American community. I think we all know what they are: heart disease, cancer, stroke, homicide, obesity, hypertension, smoking, Alzheimer's, and other dementias. And we know many of these things come from our poor diet, our fried foods, our fatty foods, and of course the health disparities that we have because of what happens in an unequal medical system, the way that it's set up. When we get to dementias a little bit later, we're also going to talk about vascular neurocognitive disorder. And this is based more on diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, which lead to heart disease and strokes. Let's not forget, as we've heard from Reverend McNeil, of course, that COVID-19 is also disproportionately killing the Black and Brown community, and we are disproportionately under-vaccinated. So certainly an issue for another time. Let's go to our next slide and look at issues with pain treatment. And this is a major health disparity. Now, we all know that there are major disparities in healthcare according to the National Academy of Medicine. We know that we're not given appropriate cardiac care, kidney dialysis, transplants. We don't receive the best treatments for stroke, cancer, or AIDS. But as compared with our white peers, we as African Americans are more likely to have our pain underestimated, more likely to have our pain undertreated, and less likely to receive opioid analgesics. And this is based on, of course, some very archaic belief systems that are in the medical community. And we'll address that in just a moment. But despite this, what happens most, what matters most, now let's go to our next slide, is that we have to stay strong. Family, faith, planning, claiming control over our health, despite these inequities, is most important, especially at the end of life, because there are many positive psychological effects with having empowerment, having autonomy. We have an incredible campaign going on with Compassion and Choices, part of the African American Leadership Council, and that central theme is planning equals peace. And I know that you all can relate to that. But just as sadly with health disparities in general, let's talk about the health disparities at the end of life. Next slide. So the following are the reasons for disparities in end-of-life care. Many of them have been documented by the Journal of American Geriatric Society. We see that a lot of this comes from our unique culture, our religious preference, our cultural beliefs, difficulties talking about end of life, but a lot of it from the health disparities, a lot of it from the systematic racism that we feel, which gives us a lack of engagement in these certain topics that I'll be bringing up. The first one is the lack of knowledge about hospice, and we know how important that is. Spiritual beliefs regarding palliative care, where we think that we're giving up on life, or that we don't want to talk about medical aid in dying, especially when palliative care is such an important part of that. I was listening to a Sammy Davis song the other day that said, "I want to live until I die." Well, let me say this, I want to live with dignity until I die. And of course, less trust in the healthcare system, poor communication with our healthcare providers, and less comfort discussing death with our families. Let's go to our next slide. And we also see that Black Americans receive more aggressive care, sometimes unnecessary care at the end of life. For example, in the final months of life here, if you take a look at this chart, African Americans are more likely to be hospitalized in the ICU. They're more likely to be admitted into intensive care unit with regard to breast cancer. And again, those two statistics versus those of white Americans, and African American nursing home residents with severe dementia are more likely to receive a feeding tube. 18% for African Americans versus 3% for whites. And paradoxically, and I discussed this just a moment ago, Black patients are much less likely to receive adequate pain control. But here's the number that you're seeing at the bottom here, percentage completed in advanced directives. Reverend McNeil addressed this. 36% for African Americans, 67% for whites. So with this lower percentage, we place ourselves more at risk for aggressive care because we have less advanced directives. We engage in establishing the advanced directive much less. Let's go to hospice care on our next slide, something that I alluded to. Hospice care is a service that provides compassionate medical care at the end of life, and it's based on an individual's needs. Hospice care is provided by a team of healthcare professionals, and certainly a person in the home, if we provide it there, who is the linchpin, the person who's providing most of that care with the support of the people from hospice care. Hospice care can serve as a major support in our U.S., in our country, but studies indicate that African Americans use hospice care at a much lower rate. Again, as pointed out by Reverend McNeil, hospice provides support to the families and the patient. And this in addition to our wonderful chaplains who are providing spiritual support if requested. Now, hospice, let me be clear here, is not a place where you send your loved ones to die, or if you have it at home, just say, well, we give up and we give in. No, it's about comfort and compassion. And we as Black and brown people need to educate ourselves on the advantages of hospice and use it when we need it, including, of course, palliative care. Now, let's go to our next slide and talk about dementia. Just like other healthcare disparities, dementia disproportionately affects the African American community at higher rates. Alzheimer's disease, for example, the most common type of dementia, is the 6th leading cause of death among white people, but the 4th leading cause of death for Black people. Black people like me, Black people in their senior years. The Black population age 65 and up is projected to more than double in size in the next 10 years, which means the dementia diagnosis in our community could more than double in number. And dementia is a silent epidemic among Black people because many of us refuse to acknowledge or discuss this sometimes horrific disease. And its increasing toll is also due to untreated or inadequately treated hypertension, diabetes, causing vascular dementia. And this occurrence is due to the progressive destruction of the vascular supply based on strokes and vascular disease. And the disease progress here, I can tell you, unlike Alzheimer's, is slow. It's what we call in psychology and psychiatry and neuropsychology a patchy deterioration. So family members, it's here and there, not overall like Alzheimer's. And so many times our families become shocked because we don't see, the lack of memory as an initial cause, but more perhaps of a change in thinking. And by the way, let me point out that vascular dementia happens between the ages of 60 and 70. That means it happens much younger to us in the Black and brown and other communities, whereas Alzheimer's is 65 and above. So vascular dementia is a real issue for us. The good news is, if we can treat the underlying issues, if we can treat, the obesities, if we can treat the heart conditions and so on, then we have a better chance of trying to avoid vascular dementia. So let's go to our next slide. What's important? How do we combat all these issues I discussed? First, you have to educate yourself about end-of-life options. Empower yourself to make your own informed decisions. That's what we talk about with autonomy. Advocate for you and your loved ones. Have candid conversations with friends, families, faith leaders, medical providers, and other people in your support system. And just as Reverend Dr. Gilmore had stated, if someone doesn't want to discuss it, but you as the person with illness at the end of life want to discuss it, then darn it, put your foot down and say, we are going to talk about this. Complete advance directives and identify your power of attorney. Also, fill out your financial end-of-life planning documents. We just talked about this in a Compassion and Choices workshop that we just had with world-famous Julianne Malveaux, a great economist, and Ricardo D. Thomas, who's also working with us on this initiative. Share your wishes with the medical proxy, doctors and loved ones. Distribute copies everywhere of your advance directive and keep them in an accessible place, because it's great to have an advance directive, but if we can't find it, we're back where we started from with not having one sometimes. Assess and reassess your goals of care throughout your disease progression. Update your advance directive regularly. I know I do with mine, and I also update my living will, especially when I have an argument with my family members. I'm going to look at that advance directive again, and I'm going to look at that living will, right? Also, you can go to compassionandchoices.org for your plan, your care resources. And here's what's there. Let's go to the next slide. You're going to see some important tools here. We have tools to help you understand your options, plan your care, and communicate with your loved ones. There's a Plan Your Care Resource Center for free online tools, so you could look at advanced directive guidelines and tools to finish strong. We have an end-of-life decisions guide and toolkit that's a step-by-step detailed informational guide that will help you think through your priorities for your end-of-life care. We have a diagnosis decoder that takes you through several exercises based on your illness that generates questions to share at your doctor's appointments. There's a dementia values and priorities tool that helps those facing dementia or caregivers responsible for a dementia patient in order to document your wishes. And then lastly, with COVID-19, well, this has given us a new awareness of our own mortality, making end-of-life planning more important than ever. And with that awareness, we know a new set of challenges, confusion over treatment options, and concerns about dying in complete isolation from family, exactly the death many of us have always feared the most. And by the way, the COVID-19 Toolkits has lots of info, including a series of webinars to help you navigate your care preferences at end of life. Again, go to www.compassionandchoices.org for your plan of care or plans of care that fit all of your needs. All right, let me turn it over now to Brandy Alexander, our National Director of Community Engagement. Over to you, Brandy.
Thank you, Dr. Beth. Thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to now address some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat box. First one is someone asking about the song. What a great song. Is there a way we can access it in the future? It is available on YouTube. If you Google YouTube, this is our song, or we'll also provide the link in the chat so that you can access it. The next question is, could Dr. Jeff share the reference of the aggressive pain slide, please? If that is in that slide, if not, we will follow up with that information.
Sure. And what was the question again, Brandy?
The reference for the aggressive care slide.
Yeah, we can make that available to all people at a different time, of course. We'll make sure that we post that. But also, if you have any questions about that, I mean, the bottom line is this. The less that you have an advance directive, according to the studies that I cited, the more at risk you will be for aggressive medical care. So it really is about the autonomy and making sure you get the care that you want and the care that you deserve.
Thank you. The next one is, how does someone make end-of-life decisions when dealing with early onset dementia? They're under the impression that people dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia who still have sound mind cannot authorize others to follow their compassionate end choices. Is that true? So as Dr. Jeff mentioned, we do have our dementia toolkit, which is the values worksheet. And so it actually is for people either at the beginning of dementia or a caregiver for someone who already has it. So that might be a great resource to start, as well as I will show you on the next slide our end-of-life consultation email address and phone number, where we have counselors available who can also answer that question for you more specifically.
Exactly. And I would add here that when you do have dementia, there are different types of dementia. And as I stated, with vascular dementia, your memory may not be the first thing that goes. There may be some cognitive issues, but especially during the earlier stages and depending on the treatment that you are receiving, that you may still be considered to be cognitively competent enough to make that decision when it comes to medical aid in dying. But of course, that has to be assessed along with physicians, at least 2 physicians. When you're 6 months, you have no more than 6 months left to live, but you may still be competent. Just because you have Alzheimer's or some other type of dementia doesn't mean that you are emotionally or cognitively incompetent.
Thank you. There's a question whether the recording will be available, and yes, we'll be happy to email it to you. You can email me at balexander@Compassion and Choices, or even just info@, and we'll make sure we get you a copy. I think we might have time for one more question. Someone is asking about where we got the information on the completion advance directives. And again, in the follow-up, we'll send that info out of the studies, but there are a few studies that show the disparity between the two, between communities completing those documents. So as I stated, we do have our consultation program, which that information is on screen now, as well as some of the other resources that Dr. Jeff mentioned, including our Finish Strong tools. And I just also wanted to mention that our COVID toolkit, as well as some of our other materials, are also available in English and Spanish and can be found at our End of Life Planning Center on the website. Next slide. I would like to invite you all to the next webinar, which is happening March 4th. It is in partnership with the City of Hope, and it's about cinema at end of life. The executive producer of the 2019 film Here a While will discuss his motivations and factors for creating the movie about end of life choices. So the link is available here on the slide, but you can also find it at compassionandchoices.org/webinar series. And in addition to future webinars, we also have, next slide, please, an archive of our past webinars that have been happening over the past year. Those also can be accessed at the compassionandchoices.org webinar series. And you can find lots of information about National Healthcare Decisions Day. Diane Rehm hosted a webinar for us about charting your personal journey from life to death. We've got conversations on grief and loss, engaging communities of color, and lots of information available. So please visit our website for more of our webinars. Next slide. Follow us, please, on social media. We are on Twitter with Compassion and Choices, our CEO, Kim Callanan, as well as our Black Legacy Planning on Twitter. We're on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And as we mentioned, our African American Leadership Council has their own Facebook page at CNC AALC. So please join us on all of those platforms to be kept up to date with our information and more resources. And lastly, next slide. Compassion and Choices is funded almost exclusively by individual donors like you who are committed to the issues of end-of-life care and choice. So please consider making a donation today to help us expand our work and ensure that everyone's priorities and values are met at the end of life. Every donation of any amount makes a difference, and they will allow us to continue improving care and expanding options and being able to do presentations like we did today. So please go to our website, compassionandchoices.org/donate. And as our vice chair of the board, Reverend Madison Shockley, said, why he gives not only his time, but also financial contributions is because empowering Black communities to make informed decisions that fit their priorities and values is critical, particularly during the end-of-life process. So again, I thank all of our speakers for sharing their information and their stories and their expertise. Thank you, Dr. Jeff, Reverend Gilmore, Reverend McNeil, and thank you again, Reverend Kimber, for joining. This will be the end of our webinar.